Speaking out about consent and pleasure is Yoan Reed, a relationships and sex education teacher and consultant, and the co-founder of Outspoken Sex Ed. Yoan is out to talk about the connection between consent and pleasure, and to give parents confidence in talking openly with their children about sex, pleasure, love, and relationships. How do you define consent?
Most people will immediately think about sexual consent, but actually we need to probably examine the basic term. If you are talking to a young child, it's really important to start at the very basic level, asking for permission. For young children, it's very much about, here I am, this is what I would like to do. We also need to be aware of other people. And that is a very early, fundamental thing to teach your child. How do we share? And how do we share safely? And build on that so that later on, children and young people understand what sexual consent is.
We often hear about wanting to encourage kids to practice ongoing enthusiastic consent. What's your version of that?
Consent is not static. It's not a given. It is not permanent. It is a conversation that keeps going. Consent can be given and it can be withdrawn.
There's something you once said that I wanted to quote, and I quote, if a mother can't mention the word pleasure and talk to her daughter about pleasure, what hope has that girl got to be empowered to have a pleasurable sexual relationship? She's not going to put that first, is she?
I still stand by it. Yeah, it is true. How are they interrelated, consent and pleasure? Consensual sex, yes, it can be given without thinking about how it feels. But really, the message should be that if you have consensual sex, not only you should be enjoying it, but you should recognize how and if the other person is enjoying it. So consent becomes much more than that yes or no, but actually it's an ongoing conversation. Feels right just now because it feels good and it feels pleasurable to me and it feels pleasurable to you. But in 10 minutes' time, when we do something slightly different, maybe it doesn't feel so good anymore. So it becomes a reciprocal exchange and experience. And lots of young people will say to me, but it takes away the joy and the excitement if you have to constantly verbally give consent to each other. Well, there are lots of other ways that you give consent or not give consent. That body language is really important for young people to understand and recognize.
Talking about bodies, and let's focus on the clitoris right now. It doesn't even exist sometimes on anatomy diagrams, which is just unbelievable this day and age still. Yeah. So this is this only organ in the human body that's its purpose is to generate pleasure. But you've said before that in your classes, sometimes boys know more about the clitoris than girls. And that's quite surprising to you that girls wouldn't know much about their anatomy. They're 13 or 14. They might be having their periods. They're in puberty, but they are very, dissociated from their own bodies and how they work.
Mentioning the word clitoris for some people will seem unnecessary because actually it is got to do with pleasure. But really, you don't need to understand the word clitoris to understand the menstrual cycle, for example, to understand how human reproduction actually works. Teachers sometimes feel a bit uncomfortable about me mentioning the clitoris. Why? Why would you mention it? They're only in their puberty. But we don't omit mentioning penis. And actually, the head of the penis, the gland, is made out of the same structure as the clitoris. They're the same kind of very hypersensitive part of the sexual anatomy that's really important to enjoy sex one day. And so when you start to talk about how the clitoris is not just a little button on the outside that you can maybe see on the vulva, but that it extends around the vagina on the inside, and that it is sensitive all along those two legs that are forming around the vulva, people understand that, that actually means that the whole of the vulva is sensitive, and actually the whole experience of penis inside a vagina, if that's the way that people have sex, that becomes then, it's pleasurable on the penis for the man, and it's pleasurable on the inside and around the vulva for the woman. So I think once you put some equality into your teaching and sort of unpack everything that we've wrapped up and don't want to talk about, then it becomes much more acceptable and important for schools, for parents to understand that this is actually a much bigger picture. We can now start to talk about why people have sex. It's not just to make a baby, it's to feel close and intimate and safe and enjoy each other's bodies. So one little organ that's actually much bigger than we think it is can start a conversation towards gender equality, sexual pleasure, sex positivity, and children have a right to be educated effectively and positively about themselves. And that's where sex education becomes a human right as well.
So a few years ago, I was shocked to read that an American professor said that some of her female students came to university never having masturbated or had an orgasm. We don't talk about girls and masturbation. So how can we get girls to accept their bodies, touch themselves, even look at themselves, which is sometimes hard, to enjoy and understand about their bodies and about pleasure?
I observe this in classrooms. I find it harder to engage the girls in talking about pleasure and masturbation. With girls, I'm always met with red faces, maybe shame and guilt. It goes back to how we view the male body and the female body from when they're very young. Little boys have erections, they just happen, and we're used to dealing with that as parents. Who hasn't opened a nappy on a baby boy and their penis is erect and they may even pee on us, you know? And so we're used to having that idea that males are eventually going to be sexual beings. Whereas with girls, we are still very protective of them and maybe don't engage with explaining and laughing and joking about that with girls. So it becomes much more of a secret. The way that I open the conversation with girls is that, A, you have got these body parts, they are really important to you, let's name them. And the clitoris is there so that one day when you are going to have sex, you will have enjoyable sex that feels really good. You need to really explore that yourself when you feel comfortable about it. And so when you do have the feelings of, oh, what is between my legs? And now I've learned about this at school, there are different parts of it. Get a mirror, and when you're in a private space, you examine yourself. You can put the mirror between your legs and you can actually really see, because whatever diagram I'm going to show you, your body may look slightly different because every vulva looks different. Then you can explore your body with your fingers, because that is how girls and how women find out what feels good for themselves. This is not about sex. This is about self-discovery and about bodily autonomy. And once you understand and have an idea about how you feel, then you're much more likely later on to have a really good experience when you're ready to share your body with someone else. So giving the girls permission almost to explore their own body and to own their own body, that is an important part of raising a daughter.
But I also like the way you thought about this in 3 parts. One is discovering your own body, and then sharing your body, and then taking joy in sharing somebody else's body.
We need to engage young people in understanding their own body and give them knowledge about their own body and make them powerful enough to explore their own body. Because once you can, you understand what feels good for you. And then you're much more likely to be able to give consent to pleasurable sex. And as you said, you are then much more likely to be able to recognize what is good for another person.
In porn, women are so performative when it comes to pleasure and these, orgasms and things like that. And consent doesn't even enter into porn as well. So tell us about how porn affects both girls and boys in terms of pleasure and consent especially.
Most young people will use pornography in the early stages to actually understand what sex is. We need to then challenge that, and we need to bring it up in education and unpick it and make sure that young people understand that actually it's not built on consent and pleasure. It's a commercial product made for the male gaze. I did a relationships and sex education needs assessment with a group of 13, 14-year-olds. Boys put the themes of pornography and pleasure on top of their priority list to learn about, and girls put consent and safe relationships. For me, it was just such a picture of what's going on at the moment. Whereas boys are interested in sex and not just in porn, but also in pleasure. What feels good? Why do we have sex? Let's learn more about it. Girls are still very protective and protected. And so for them, it's much more about how to keep safe. It is a reflection of what goes on in the media, the stories that young people and adults are engaging with in terms of sexism, Me Too.
It helps to step back a bit too and look at our culture and always question our culture and to think about how so much is geared towards the male gaze, ads and films and things to sort of, be arousing or erotic to men. And I think if you start questioning that even with girls and say, wow, what would it be like if we walked down the street and we were besieged by, billboards and things that were making us, sort of sexually provoked the way these guys have.
We live at a time where lots of social taboo, especially around sexuality and gender equality, are really being challenged. And we need to use that positively and pick it up and start talking about it amongst ourselves in our own peer groups and also with our children. Having young male sons, I learned so much from asking them about how they see things. And if I am challenged by what they're saying, I find it, it's really healthy for me to say, well, from a female perspective, this is what I'm feeling or thinking. Ask questions and engage in their world and see how you can start a conversation on the back of that.
So after a workshop you did once with mothers and daughters, one woman wrote, I was happy with all the information until you mentioned the word pleasure. Why is it so hard for people to talk about pleasure?
The word pleasure is often put right next to sex. Regarding the sensual body, we become very protective of children because we don't want to sexualize our children. Children experience pleasure on their body right from being an infant. We can extend it into talking about sexuality if we dare. Now, I think one of the main reasons we don't is because we don't actually have the skills. Most of us didn't have the teaching or the comfort of discussing it when we were young ourselves. It does demand that we look at our own experiences. If you are full of shame and guilt about pleasure in your own body, then you are unlikely to be able to project a healthy sexual relationship when talking to your children. So you need to start with yourself. And then the next step would be to speak to a partner or to a good friend. It is amazing the kind of conversations you can have, and you see the similarities in other people and you hear their experiences, and you can start to discuss how you want the world for your children to be different to the one you grew up in, or how you want your children to experience their sexual lives. Their right to have a pleasurable and loving relationship with someone. That is really important for most parents, but to really speak it and act it out in terms of discussion with other people, that is extremely helpful. So start with examining, how do I feel about it as a person? What are my own experiences? How has that hindered me, or how has it helped me in who I am now? And how would I like it to be different or maybe the same for my own child? Children and young people will learn about these things with or without your help. They may not learn in a good way. They may have to go through lots of different experiences that are not particularly good for them. Our children will certainly have the same needs of sexual pleasure that we have as adults. So we need to also be courageous enough to open up that conversation. If you haven't engaged with body positivity in terms of the sexual anatomy from a young age, then it may be also quite difficult to engage with an older teenager. Certainly talking about something you've never talked about before. The first thing to say to yourself is, I don't know how to do it really well. I'm going to try and educate myself first of all, find some resources, get some information and maybe some support from someone else. And then also say, I don't know very much about it. Because when I grew up, I didn't have the information that I want you to have now. And so I don't have the skills. And I don't really have the comfort either, but I'm trying. That's very honest. And they are more likely to want to engage when they're not being told what to do or they're not being told off for something. But actually they understand that, oh, okay, my mom, my dad are also learning and are also interested in making this good for me. So it does strengthen that relationship.
sort of everyone appreciating and accepting each other.
Yeah, it's a good practice of consent, I would really like to speak to you about sexual development of bodies. And if your child goes, I really don't want to talk about that. Well, okay. You can't just plow on and keep going. You're crossing a boundary here and it doesn't feel right. You need to respect that, and you need to have different ways of engaging. The messages that you give to your child in everyday life, your values around sex, around relationships, how do you act it out yourself? That is probably the biggest message that your child will pick up from you, and much more important than sitting down and having a 10-minute conversation about clitoris. Whoever I speak to, they all want their children to have good relationships. And just because we have not received adequate relationships and sex education, it doesn't mean that we can't re-educate ourselves. That's what Outspoken is there to do, is to engage that body of adults who are responsible for children's well-being. And we need those skills to be practiced and discussed amongst ourselves as well.
Hi, I'm Leah, Director of Outspoken Sex Ed. We're out to make parents feel more comfortable and confident talking openly and honestly with their kids about sex and relationships topics, and even enjoy learning from them. Outspoken is a social enterprise, which means that we survive in large part thanks to your donations. So please head over to outspokeneducation.com. It's our great website where you can donate and sign up for our fantastic newsletter and begin having these conversations more easily and openly with your kids starting now.